Thank you for stopping by. I am Jeffrey Weiss, your political activist, keeping you informed of local and world events. Today we discuss how our government, the military, and transnational corporations interact to plunder the world. Our transnational corporations need very big projects to keep growing, building airports, railroad systems, telecommunication enterprises, oil drilling operations, pipelines, and refineries. Our country needs resources: oil, natural gas, precious metals. Our economy needs cheap goods to placate the people. So, we go in and propose to the country in question and tell them that if they agree to deal with our corporations, the return on their dollar of investment will be 3 to 1. So the country's president or finance minister signs off on the deal because they truly believe the numbers we float to them: money for schools, hospitals, roads, bring their people out of poverty, create better lives for the indigenous people. The corporations come in and build the infrastructure, and the assets of the poor nation begin flowing to America. What if the country won't agree to allow U.S. corporations to do business in the country, you ask? Well then, our silent partners go in and explain the new reality to them. The CIA? Correct. They say, Mr. President, that if you don't cooperate, there will be a coup d'etat, and the next day you'll be on the other side of the prison bars. There is no spiritual God when it comes to the transnational corporations. There's only the God of money. Soon the company's resources run dry and become too expensive to develop. However, the debt remains and only gets bigger since the country can barely pay the interest. Soon the country's bankrupt, so they turn to us, meaning the CIA, and ask what they can do. Why not just declare bankruptcy, you ask? If they do that, they get locked out of the international payment system, and all their foreign assets can be confiscated. They can't trade except with cash, no credit, and they can't trade at all with debtor nations. It's a death sentence. So, they go along with the program, you ask? There is no option. They are caught in a web of debt that ensures their continued cooperation with the CIA and the corporations. The CIA sets up death squads that crush any opposition to the president and his party. The government spies on left-leaning individuals and groups and fills the prisons with them. Our military sets up a base in the country to protect the interests of our corporations and the loyalty of the local government. Maybe we control their vote in the UN. In the meantime, our corporations hire the local people at slave wages, who then toil in inhumane conditions, heat, chemicals, poisons. The oil companies pump toxins into the rainforest rivers, kill indigenous people who just happen to live in a floodplain or below an unstable rock quarry. The forests are denuded, the lakes poisoned. We create energy companies like Enrons, who are audited by accounting firms like Anderson, who cover up the fact that massive bribes are being paid to keep the operation in foreign countries going. It's Monsanto, General Electric, Nike, General Motors, Walmart, ExxonMobil. We rape and pillage countries with the same intensity and lack of concern for human life as the Vikings of yore. We turn human beings into slaves. It's no different from the slavery here in America in the 16th and 17th century. These were people who lived in harmony with the environment, cared for Mother Nature because they know that in turn she would care for them. Instead of helping indigenous people by building schools, roads, hospitals, we wage war. Already we've dropped an estimated $5 trillion in Iraq and Afghanistan alone. And counting those relevancy legacy costs, the long-term health care commitments to U.S. veterans, and interest on the debt incurred by these wars, the total is projected to be $12 trillion by 2053. For 1/10 of the cost of servicing the debt we saddled those countries with, we could feed, provide housing, education, hospitals, clean water, clothing, communications networks, and safety for every single poor person living there. The key to any contract was to show the GNP growth of the country due to the project. But the closer was, how much of a kickback to the leaders and the wealthy landowners of the country there would be. The bigger the project, the larger the loan, the greater the effect on the GNP of the country, and last but not least, the amount of money that would flow into the local politicians' pockets. And the bigger the loan, the longer the country would be politically loyal to America. Often we focused on countries that were anti-American and anti-capitalistic. Those were the ones we could derive the most benefit from. While some would say, why didn't we just get out of those countries? Was it a way to bring the country, we saw it as a way to bring the country into the U.S. sphere of influence. It was to fill our pockets with gold. We need examples, you say? Bechtel, Halliburton, Stone and Webster, Brown and Root. More specific, you urge? You want names, dates, places? The whole thing started in Iran in 1951. Iran rebelled against a British oil company that was exploiting Iranian natural resources and its people. In response, the democratically elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, nationalized the country's petroleum assets. Both the U.S. and England feared any retaliation against the Iranian government would lead to a confrontation with the Soviet Union. So instead of sending in the Marines, the U.S. sent in CIA agent Kermit Roosevelt, who used payoffs and threats to win the people over. He organized street riots and violent demonstrations that made Mossadegh look unpopular. Finally, Mossadegh was overthrown and the pro-American Mohammad Reza Shah, or as we know him, the Shah of Iran, a brutal dictator who killed tens of thousands using CIA-trained death squads, was put in his place. Men like me, not just me, I have enough blood on my hands, I don't need to take credit for others, said one of the economic hitmen. The timing was perfect. The 60s saw the growth of organizations like the World Bank, International Monetary Fund. Many people think they are independent entities, when in fact they are funded primarily by the U.S., and so they do the bidding of the U.S. and U.S. interests. The CIA would target certain countries, then notify the country, like the one that the economic hitmen worked for, and point out the targets. They went in, developed a business plan that would make the rulers and their friends rich, and then make the country dependent on continued American investment. If things went south, if they were exposed, then the situation would be chalked up to corporate greed, not American intervention. Specific examples, you insist. Okay, Indonesia, 1965. Sukarno took over the country. He formed close ties with Russia and the communist governments in exchange for military equipment and training. Americans saw it was losing the war in Vietnam, decided Indonesia was all of a sudden important. The U.S. government, e.i. the CIA, wanted to make Indonesia an example of success that other countries in the region would follow, and it just so happened they had oil. It was decided that to modernize the country and make it a model of capitalism and democracy, we would electrify the country. The people were sent in with the rationalization that if we help the country, even though knowing it was selfish, enrich ourselves, enrich the leaders and their cronies in Indonesia, then make the people poorer was the proper course of action. It was the opposite of everything that you learn in school, modernizing the country and make the rich richer and the poor poorer. We didn't work with countries, we worked on countries. In 1972, President Omar Torrijos was a populist, loved by his people in Panama, dedicated to the poor and dispossessed. He gave no favor to the rich, and he offered sanctuary to rebels and freedom fighters. Other countries in South and Central America looked to Torrijos' style of government as a model for their own. Bottom line was, Torrijos was not a puppet of America. He worked for social reform without aligning himself with either the U.S. or communist countries. But now Torrijos was standing in the way. He objected to a U.S. base located in the Canal Zone, which taught dictators and military leaders of the countries in Central America the techniques of torture, interrogation, and forming death squads. He insisted that the Panama Canal be the sole possession of his country. Torrijos was negotiating with Japanese businessmen to build a new, larger canal whose construction would exclude American firms like Bechtel and Stone & Webster. He was assassinated by American business interests when the CIA put a bomb on his plane. When the U.S. invaded Panama in 1989, the documents of the investigation of the crash mysteriously disappeared. Torrijos was a marked man when he supported the Nicaraguan Sandinista rebels who had toppled U.S.-backed Somoza dictatorship. Torrijos died just after Reagan's inauguration, just 2 months after Ecuador's President Jaime Roldos died in similar circumstances. The CIA is so blatant that they didn't even feel they needed to create a new method of execution. Then there was Ecuador. In 1968, we discovered oil. Texaco went in and built a trans-Andean pipeline. It's already spilled 1 million barrels of oil into the rainforest. That's 4 times the damage the Exxon Valdez did. Recently, the big construction companies built a $1 billion 300-mile pipeline. They had to cut down vast areas of the rainforest. The country used to have 15% of the world's bird species. They're pretty much gone, along with the macaws and jaguars. The indigenous cultures have collapsed, the rivers transformed into flaming cesspools. Between 1971 and 1992, Chevron and Texaco spilled 4 million gallons of toxic waste water in almost 350 uncovered pits that are killing people, deforming babies, making animals extinct. Poverty went from 50 to 70%. Unemployment went from 15 to 70%. National debt went from 240 million to 16 billion. And we call that progress. The cost of servicing the debt is 10 times what the country spends on health and education. The only way they can service the debt is to sell the rest of the rainforest to the oil companies. After the oil embargo ended in 1974, the U.S. needed a way to control the price of oil, so they made a deal with the devil. The U.S. would provide guaranteed military protection for the Saudis. In exchange, when the U.S. bought oil and paid the Saudis, they in turn would use the monies to buy U.S. Treasury bonds. The interest on the bonds would pay for the modernization of the country. How did that lead to 9/11, you ask? The Saudis had a problem. They needed to keep the Wahhabis happy. Those extremists had the power to overthrow the regime. So the Saudis financed jihadism throughout the Middle East. The U.S. chose to look the other way, considering the need to keep oil prices stable. The Saudis financed Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations. After all, the Saudis supported Harkin Oil, a company George H.W. Bush was an investor in. Later, Old George, as a principal of the Carlyle Group, laundered money through the Saudis. So when 9/11 took place, George Jr. made sure the wealthy Saudis and members of the Bin Laden family got out of the country at a time when all flights were grounded. Modern empires pillaged behind the pen and paper, whereas the Romans in the 1st century, then the English in the 16th century, and the Spanish in the 17th century did not offer a hand in friendship, but plundered, killed, stripped bare the people and the land in various countries. Now it's like Oscar Wilde said, there are those who do evil to attain the thing they love. Some do it with a bitter look, some with a flattering word. The coward does it with a kiss, the brave man with a sword. Some strangle with the hands of lust, some with the hands of gold. Some do the deed with many tears, some without a sigh. We worked hand in hand with the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, organizations run or controlled by America, which in turn is controlled by the transnational corporations and the military-industrial complex. Give you names, you say? Sure. Robert McNamara went from Ford Motor Company to Secretary of Defense to the World Bank. George Shultz went from Bechtel to Secretary of Treasury under Nixon. Caspar Weinberg was Bechtel's VP, then became Secretary of Defense under Reagan. Richard Helms was Johnson's CIA director, then became ambassador to Iran. Dick Cheney was president of Halliburton before becoming Secretary of Defense under George H.W. Bush and VP under George W. Bush. George H.W. Bush founded Zapata Petroleum, then served as U.S. ambassador to the UN, then CIA director under Gerald Ford. The World Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the U.S. Agency for International Development, International Monetary Fund, roam the globe providing good for the projects we put our stamp of approval on. They preach the virtues of modernization, technology, massive infrastructure. But all it does is indent the country, turn the environment into a cesspool of toxic waste, enslave the local population, and throw whatever progress those poor bastards made back into the Stone Age. The U.S. relied on the Monroe Doctrine, which took manifest destiny to the next level, asserting that we had the right to invade any country in Central and South America that refused to abide by U.S. policy. The doctrine was used to invade the Dominican Republic and Venezuela, among others. The rationale behind every action of the CIA, transnational corporations, was to make the U.S. the greatest empire in the world, not just now, but of all history. Cheap labor and cheap vital natural resources were the fuel that enables continued growth of America's industry, thus America itself. The people told the economic hitman that it was a win-win game. However, what he began to see and finally saw was that it was a zero-sum game. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. It was just one massive conspiracy. If it were that simple, the members of the conspiracy could be rooted out and brought to justice. But the system is based on a fantasy that economic growth benefits mankind, and the greater growth, the more widespread the benefits. And the people and firms who provide the growth are rewarded commensurately. The economic growth only benefits the very rich and the very powerful of the debtor nation, while the people sink deeper into poverty and depravity. The bottom line is, greed is rewarded. The banks, the corporations, and the government, by its proxy the CIA, form a corptocracy that uses its fiscal, military, and technical expertise to suck the very life out of a country, then control what's heard in the news, read in schools, and advertised on TV. But they didn't realize one flaw in the system. The monstrous greed that feeds the system requires ever-increasing amounts of fuel and maintenance. So much so that it will consume everything out there, then have no choice but to consume itself. And we're guilty as well, not just the corporations. We buy and eat and buy, consuming the resources of our world, then the next world. In turn, we ship them toxic waste, destroying their air, water, and soil. We're all guilty as hell. Right now, we live in a world where a chosen few swim in riches that only a few Egyptian kings or Roman emperors had, while the majority drowned in power, pollution, and violence. What can we do, you ask? We don't have to do anything. History tells us that empires never last. Every one of them, in the end, fails horribly. They destroy other cultures, which in turn leaves fewer to pillage. In the end, they consume themselves. Either we, the people, become aware of the devastation, rise up and force the system to change, or one day we will be the slaves of another, more powerful, younger culture. If my articles interest you, please use the link to check out my website and books. Thank you very much.